Let's review the 24-inch iMac M1 and also M1 processor in general. As I'm releasing this video, we're only a few hours away from WWDC, so some of the opinions that I share here may change once we see if Apple have released or announced a new hardware at their developer conference. Let's find out. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. There are many great 24-inch iMac M1 reviews, and I definitely recommend that you check them out. I'll approach this review from a different perspective, and hopefully you'll get something new out of this. I'm also going to be reviewing Apple Silicon M1 because the iMac and pretty much many of the Apple computers now with the M1 processors, they're pretty much all intertwined together. We're going to look at this machine from two different users groups. One of them is going to be the casual enthusiast, and the other one is going to be the pro. Let's have a look at the casual and enthusiast user. I think that this machine will fit in just fine. If you want to have a machine with great display, great speakers, to browse the web, to just pretty much do anything creatively or light creative uses, this would be perfect for that. You can even use image editing program on here, which will run fine. So if you're not dealing with thousands of images at a time, you're not doing this for revenue, you're just really doing this to really satisfy your creative needs, I think that this would be the perfect machine that you may want to look into getting. But if we're now talking about the pro users, we can divide the pro users into about 4 main categories. And I'm sure that we can subdivide it more, but these are the ones that I'm really going to focus on. So first, let's talk about graphic designers. If you are doing design for interactive, for web, for print, this machine will work just fine for that with minimal issue whatsoever. And even though your design software may be running on Rosetta 2, it's going to be able to handle what you do just fine. The next group of creative pros we need to talk about are video pros. And I'm not talking about the high-end video pros, cinema pro, or editing houses here. I'm just talking about video pros who are just pretty much doing different type of commercial that doesn't necessarily demand, for example, like Hollywood production quality. These machines are going to do an amazing job at this. Apple has been refining their hardware and coding engine for years now. It can do a really great job. This is evidence in the iPad and iPhone that has been released throughout the years, how it can compress a video file much faster than the Intel counterpart can do. So for Video Pro, this is not going to be a problem at all. It can handle the codecs just fine. It'll be able to do the work without any issues whatsoever. If you're doing visual effects, well, you may start running into a limitation with video cards, but if you're really doing that type of work, you'll be using a dedicated rig with dedicated software to really run on all of those, and these won't necessarily be the machine for you anyway. So the next group of users I want to touch on is the Audio Pro. If you're doing Audio Pro, can this work? To a certain extent, you can. For example, you can use a Thunderbolt to use the external enclosure and plug all your cards in there. But here's the thing. I've talked to a few audio engineers before, and usually what they do is they have these big setup and they have all these things plugged into the machine. They have the cards, multiple different cards that they use to do sound editing and all these signal coming in. These machines are not necessarily for it yet, and I don't think that the M1 processor are ready for pro audio because some of the software that are running on the computer are not necessarily running natively on the M1 processors just yet. And if you're going to do the work, you want to do it on the native machine. Now, we're going to approach the last group of Creative Pro, and this is something that is near and dear to my heart because this is what I do. I'm a photographer. So let's talk about Apple Silicon M1 and also the 24-inch iMac from a photographer perspective. Now, I will say that I do weddings and events, so I deal with thousands of files at a time. I also do architecture, to which I shoot in HDR base. I do different layering, and I'm dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of files at a time too on those type of shoots that I do. When I'm editing my images in general, my philosophy is not hours and minutes, but it's minutes and seconds. So the one thing I'll tell you right now is that if you have 1,000 raw files, and if whatever you're about to do with those files, those 1,000 files, just take 1 more second to do on each one of those files, that's 1,000 seconds. That equivocates itself to close to 17 minutes to edit those 1,000 files. If you multiply that by 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 files, and you're applying a lot of complex editing on top of that, that time starts to add up exponentially. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, I make more money being behind a camera than sitting in front of a computer, as much as I enjoy doing this part. So what we need to do is think about how can we get a machine that will run as fast as possible and minimize our time that we spend in front of our display. And this is where we have to talk about a few things about the M1 in general. At this point in time, I believe we are already seeing peak M1 performance, meaning that as software in the future gets released to run natively on the M1 processor, for example, Lightroom Classic, the performance increase that we're going to see are going to be 10, 20, maybe 30%. It's not going to be a 50% increase, and it's definitely not going to be a 100% increase where you have double the performance. This is easily seen, for example, in a program such as Lightroom Cloud version. You can see that when you're comparing the native version versus the version running on Rosetta 2. This is also clearly seen in Capture One, the video that I just recently released. You can see that for the most part, when you're just using the CPU core to render the preview and it's not really taxing the RAM that hard, well, for the most part, this M1 processor does a really great job. And in fact, it just beats out my 12-core Mac Pro machine that costs a lot more money. And it definitely beat out the 2019 16-inch MacBook Pro. And that's also something that you can see in the export too, where it really beats out the MacBook Pro, but yet it still can't beat out the Mac Pro that's running on the Radeon Pro Vega 2 with 32 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory. So it has yet to beat out those really powerful video cards. And if you're really looking for a higher performance, the best thing that you can do right now is to wait until Apple releases the next processor iteration with more cores and also more GPUs so you can utilize and really push that performance further. These are the seconds and minutes I'm talking about here that I think these machines are great. Don't get me wrong. I think that Apple have done a really amazing job creating the Rosetta 2 translation layer. This is technically the third time that they have gone through a silicon change. So they have done a really great job mitigating all of these, making sure the experience for the most part is really smooth transition. But when it really comes to the performance, we're now seeing the cap for M1. A couple of other things that we're also seeing on the cap for these machines is that if you're a pro and you use Lightroom Classic, Lightroom loves RAM. And the max amount of RAM that we can put in these machines are 16 gigabytes. So that's a limitation there. The video card that we can use on these machines, for instance, they're integrated in, which is great, but you can only get 8 cores right now on the upgrade one, and that's pretty much the max. And these 8-core performance altogether performs on the range of a Radeon RX 560 or an NVIDIA 1050 Ti. So they're not necessarily video cards that will blow anything out of water. In fact, they're not even as fast as many of the video cards that are on the market today. So that's just something to think about there. We know something better and more pros coming down the pipeline. And this is why I have always been advocating for many of us to just wait. Because here's the thing. I know that many of us, and I consult with many photographers, we don't change machines that often. I mean, if you are a technologist, if you are a nerd like myself, then yeah, we're definitely going to be upgrading a machine that often. But majority of photographers I consult with, they just want to have a good, reliable machine. And I think that waiting for that is going to give you the best advantage at this point. So that's pretty much my thought about the M1 processor in general. And as WWDC rolls around, we may see another new processor, for example, the M1X or the M2, and we're going to see a big performance jump there. So hopefully they release something. But now let's go back to the 24-inch iMac review. I think that it is a great machine, but depending on the type of creative pro work that you do, this may not be the machine for you. If you're looking for a desktop machine, I recommend getting the Mac Mini for a few reasons. You can link up 2 displays on that system, so you can choose the display whether it's hardware calibrated or software calibrated, and you can choose the color gamut for the display that you want to link up to your Mac Mini to do pro editing workflow. Secondly, on the Mac Mini, that's the only one in the M1 lineup right now that you can get a native 10 gigabit Ethernet connection. If you're using 10 gigabit Ethernet in your network, that is pretty much a must-have. There's no other ways around it. Granted, yes, on the inner machines, what you can do is buy a dongle, but you're looking at spending $150 to $250 to get a Thunderbolt to a 10 gigabit dongle, which does use up one of the ports. So those are things that you need to balance and think about. If you're looking for a portable machine, the one that I recommend is the MacBook Pro. And the reason why is because the MacBook Pro has a fan and the MacBook Air does not have a fan. Having a fan is better, especially for example, if you're running Lightroom Classic and you're pushing the processor hard, you want a way for the machine to be able to go in and dissipate that heat fast and not thermal throttle the system. So those are just some things to think about there. And the other reason why I recommend Mac Mini over the iMac also is, for instance, when I'm running Lightroom and I'm doing a lot of exporting, a lot of editing, a lot of heavy tasks, the fan on here would pretty much kick on right away, and you can definitely hear it. And you can also feel the hot air coming out on the bottom and the middle too, because there's two fans inside here, and it pulls cool air in on the side, it cools the processor and pushes the hot air out on the bottom. The Mac Mini fan is running all the time, but it is a larger fan and it doesn't have to speed up that much to pretty much cool the processor down. So that's another advantage of having a Mac Mini, comparing it to the 24-inch iMac M1. Being that this is my channel and I talk a lot about displays, Apple displays have always been really great. So this is a 24-inch 4.5K. You're definitely getting the above 200 pixels per inch, so you're definitely getting Retina. And to get these type of true Retina on an external display, it's really hard to get on many other ones that are out there. There may be some 27-inch 5K that you can get that will do Retina, but otherwise, it's not really, mostly available, and you can't really get hardware calibrated display that are necessarily true Retina at this point. So those are just some things to think about. The color gamut for these are P3, and if we notice one thing is that Apple never listed the percent for P3 coverage, and there's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, this is the only machine that they have in this size, right? I mean, granted, you can get them in other colors, but it's not as if you can go in and choose the different panels, a different manufacturer for the panel, or the quality. You just get the Apple iMac. So that's the reason why they don't list the color space. But being a pro, sometimes you want to know the color space. But the other reason too, I think that when Apple are manufacturing a lot of these, they're not just sourcing these panels from one company, they're sourcing it from multiple display manufacturers. And as long as they meet the minimum specs, they're pretty much going to be okay. And that's the same thing here. Granted, Apple does pick really great displays, really great backlight technology, and they do a really good job engineering, integrating the whole thing in. So the backlight bleeding on this display is pretty much minimal. The uniformity is actually pretty good for the most part. So, I mean, it is a really great display that's in the system and with great calibration from the factory. If you are a pro and you require color accurate work, the recommendation is to go in and run a software calibration on these displays so that you are actually looking at a really great colors, because the way how Apple have calibrated their display is generally a lot more blue compared to a neutral color. So when you run the calibration, you're going to get back some of those warmth, which are going to be important for instance, still photo editing. One more thing that I want to mention about the iMac display is that it has a glossy glass coating in front. And for this model, you can't add an additional fee or anything like that and get the nano texture coating. So the moment I start to turn this display, you're going to start to see that it's reflecting a lighting environment pretty heavily there. You can see the light with the honeycomb grid that I have in front there, or the egg crate. And depending on the angle that you have this at, and also the environment that you're in, this could be a really reflective display compared to, for instance, if you just get the Mac Mini and get a matted external display, which may be better for pro creative workflow anyway. So that would be the other thing. And one last thing I want to say about the glossy display is that glossy displays makes everything look amazing right away. The color pop, the contrast is there. The only problem with using this for pro workflow is that it's giving us a slightly biased, more contrast, and also slightly more saturation when we're viewing the pictures. So if you want to get the most accurate display possible, glossy would definitely not be the one to consider for pro workflow. A few other bits about the system. I really like their redesigned keyboard with the Touch ID on them. I really love the color match that they have for the purple that matches with the chassis of the machine. Although if you just look at the back of the machine in general, that purple looks more like a really navy blue in some lighting. So I really wish it's a little bit more purplish, but anyway, the trackpad is really good. There is a slightly different haptic compared to the touchpad before, the Magic Trackpad. So I like this one a little bit better. It feels a little bit softer. To me, I like the braided lightning cable that pretty much matches the color. And one more last thing I want to add about this too is that if you take a look at this iMac and you look at the shin there, I think they included a shin because number one, it is an iconic iMac design. And secondly, even though Apple could have made a thicker machine, they wanted to keep it thinner. But one more thing too is I believe what they're trying to do is that these machines, the component down here does warm up quite a bit. And what they want to do is avoid putting these warm or hot components right behind the display. And that would be maybe one of the reasons why I decided to design a machine this way. Because where you have the MagSafe plug-in, that's a lot of power going through. And usually when you have a power connection anywhere, there's a lot of heat dissipation. Not to mention the processor is pretty much just like right here in the middle of the system. So you're combining those two heat together, and I think that what they want to do is elong the life for this LCD panel and not have a heat up behind. Because if we look at all the Mac with M1s right now, all of them does have a display that separates from the system. For example, you take a look at the laptop, you have the clamshell design where the display opens up and the heat gets dissipated through the keyboard. So it's a slightly different design there. The only exception to this would be the iPad M1 for the 11 and 12.9 inch that pretty much has the processor right behind the display. But Apple also has different display technologies inside those devices too, where they really go in and custom engineer it much more than they actually have gone in and implemented in this iMac. So that's just one of my thoughts, the reason why I think that Shin is there. It's okay, it kind of goes away, it's not really a big deal, but that's just my thought about it. So anyway, that's my overall thoughts about the 24-inch iMac M1 and the M1 processor in general. I think, the best thing to do if you're a pro, we're so close to them releasing a new one. In fact, in a few hours of this video release, WWDC, you'll probably find a new processor coming down the pipeline with a larger display on a portable device. Anyway, if you have any questions about this, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new. And until next time, in art we trust.